Well, whether it is illness, aging, or another physical issue, there are some physical barriers that can really keep couples from enjoying great sex together. So, today we're going to address several of the most common physical barriers to a great sex life in your marriage to help you find ways to address them and enjoy God's gift of sex in your marriage. So, a quick search of physical issues that affect sex life tells us that things like hormonal changes, menopause, testosterone levels, those have both physical and emotional side effects. There's erectile dysfunction. There's low libido. Being overweight might affect your ability to get into some sexual positions and libido as well. Medications, their side effects. And then we have things like depression, anxiety, illness, or disability. Dr. Kim, what else would you add to that list?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I was looking yesterday just kind of through, and I found a study that had been done from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And they said by the year 2030, as many as 170 million people in the United States, more than half of all Americans, will be living with at least one chronic medical condition.
Wow.
Illness or disability that can easily derail their sex life. But then they also said it doesn't have to. So I think it falls right in we're talking. But I think that number surprised me that there's so many people that really do deal with that, because I think it's something a lot of people don't talk about, and so I think the things that you listed are all good. I also thought about, along with that, just that chronic pain that can come that people have to deal with, and, how that certainly can affect your sex life. A lot of empathy for people with that. Stress is something else I think that definitely does affect our sex life. And I think I was talking to a lady that's the head of a Christian school here, and she was just talking the difference in the stress she sees in kids today that she didn't see even 10 years ago in school. And so I think that goes all the way down to our kids and all the way up to us. And then sometimes there's intellectual disabilities like autism, some things like that where people don't really get the social cues, and how does that work with them in the sex relationship. So I think it's a really broad area that covers a lot of different things, but the bottom line is it's kind of how do we best work through that? Is there a way to embrace God's gift for sex that he's given us, or what needs to happen in those situations?
Yeah. So you're right. It's pretty broad. There's a ton of different things there. So it's not like this is one size fits all by any means.
Yeah.
But I think what we're getting at is that this is a lot that's not talked about very much. There are a lot of physical factors. Some might be things you could, deal with or get checked on. Others are not. But in all of those, there's probably some ways to handle it together.
Well, and I think didn't realize how big a scope it was, because I was just thinking back through all the years I've done in counseling, very few times has that been an issue. And most of it has been really a lot of them have been with the wife, and it's been a pain issue, and they've been able to work with their gynecologist and get that taken care of. The guys that I've worked with where it's ED, that they have been able to go to a urologist, get checked out, and a lot of them have been able to work through that. But that's been minor. And so I think it's an area that I probably will see more in the counseling room. And I think it's an area that we need. It affects a lot of people, and that we need to talk about, because
I think
people aren't talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I know you've mentioned in the past that couples were less willing to talk about their sex life in the past when you were earlier in your counseling. And haven't you seen that change? I feel like I've heard you reference that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the things that just naturally seems to come up. Before it would come up, and I'd say something, because I felt it was something that we need to talk about, just because of other things we were talking about. And there's always a little pause. And then once they got into it, it was go. But I think people are a lot more open with that now, and a lot more comfortable with it.
Yeah. And I'm wondering too, one of the reasons we're addressing this topic is because we do get questions. So, one of the great things about being an online ministry is that people are willing to say things they might not say out loud, which is great, because then we can start dealing with them. So probably the proportion of questions we see through email and anonymous questions and things like that is a little higher.
Yes.
Because of that. So we do get a fair amount of questions about that. So it's great to get that on the table.
Yeah. It's not something you probably discuss with somebody when you go out to dinner.
Right.
With another couple or something.
Right.
It's just, And so
Yeah.
you are going to do probably in a counseling situation or with a
Hmm.
physician, or where they
Yes.
can, they know that we try to help people in all areas of
Hmm.
marriage. And so they feel safe coming to us with questions like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So with all of these, okay, so we've got a lot on the table, ranging from disability, intellectual disability, illness, libido, hormones, overweight, anything in that. With all of these, what is a great first step for a couple to take here?
Well, I think you want kind of what is your problem, and if a lot of times people avoid going to a doctor or they just don't
Mm-hmm.
go, and so I think that's one of the things that I talk to couples about when there's something along this line would be to see a doctor. Is
Mm-hmm.
there anything medically that can be done to help? Is that
Mm-hmm.
if it's ED, there's medications to try. If you're overweight, maybe a
Mm-hmm.
doctor can help you in losing some weight.
Mm-hmm.
On the medications you're on, the doctor can say, yeah, this one could affect your libido or could affect
Mm-hmm.
something. And so I think we can effectively switch you to this medication. Uh, Depression, anxiety, definitely with medication and counseling. So, I mean, I would
Mm-hmm.
try to help them see, okay, what have you done and what have you not done? And make sure that we cover all those bases. And then we can see what's left there as far as a counseling need. But I think the first step is to just see, has someone availed themselves of all of the help that is there?
Mm-hmm.
And then and a lot of times counseling needs to go along with it anyway, because if that's something that's been an important part of your life, or you want that to be an important part of your life, and
Mm-hmm.
because of one of these reasons it is not or hasn't been what you want to be, well, then the emotional things that can go along with that, and counseling can certainly help as you're working on that, and to connect
Mm-hmm.
together to make that sex life what you hoped it would be and wanted it to be and what God designed it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think those are great. Those are some really simple things, but I think sometimes it's not easy to do the simple thing.
I think
Whether
it's sometimes people
yeah.
just don't, I think as guys, I think we're so much better. I mean, Nancy and I were doing a recording yesterday, and we're just talking about in at ED, and Nancy made the comment. It seems like on the sports stations you get an ED commercial
Yeah.
like every other commercial. So it's
Yeah.
obviously more talked about than
Yes.
it used to be.
Yeah.
But some of them probably maybe not be as talked about that
Mhm. When
that,
I
that we need
wonder
to.
I think we need to, and I wonder if part of the thing is, I know sometimes we just kind of accept, like, okay, this is what I'm dealing with, and it's just my cross to bear, right? I
Yes.
know that, like, I mean, it just makes me think about, like, in my house, I had this bathroom door that squeaked every morning. It would just I was pulling my hair out. I'm so irritated with this bathroom door squeaking. I'm just thinking this house, it's just what I'm, love my house. I got to deal with the squeaky door. Just got to deal with it. And finally, I'm like, wait a minute. No, I just have to go to Walmart and get a can of WD-40. And it took me about 2 minutes, to do all the
Spraying it.
doors and the entire downstairs. Like, you don't have to put up with the squeaky door. You just don't have to do it. So I think it's that step of saying, wait a minute, this is an actual thing that I could take a step to deal with. I don't have to put up with it. Or even the question of, do I have to put up with it? Maybe not. It's worth asking about.
Absolutely. What a great analogy. Yeah, exactly. Because I think we do all have things in our lives that we just kind of put up with
Hmm.
instead of doing something about it. And
Hmm.
I think it's also something that a couple, we talk so much about being on the same team,
Hmm.
communicating. This is certainly an area of that, because maybe one of you is affected in some way and the other isn't. And so
Sure.
how do we work together? How do I support my husband or my
Hmm.
wife as they go through this to get to where we both want this to be? And I think you said too, some people just kind of, it's interesting. Nancy had talked to some women, I guess, about the book that we're writing together and the
Hmm.
sexual part of it. And one lady that it's probably about our age, maybe a little bit younger, just said, well, 5 or 6 years ago, we decided sex wasn't going to be part of our marriage anymore. And we just
Oh,
thought,
wow.
and
Hmm.
there wasn't like there was any, as far as we know, reason that. But I think, and so we just kind of talked about,
Hmm.
what that does for us as a couple, the closeness,
Hmm.
and how that unites us in a way that God
Hmm.
designed. And so if there's any way that we can continue to make that a part of our life, I think it's important to do that, because besides the physical pleasure, there's a lot of other things that go into
Hmm.
a good sex life, and
Hmm.
the closeness and all the things that it gives us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think that's an interesting thought. And I think there are probably a lot of couples in that category. And they're probably not talking about it either. But you would say you think they're just missing out.
I think so, and I think, and sometimes we make assumptions. I had a couple years and years ago, but she just felt like her husband wasn't kind of pursuing her, and so she just kind of accepted that's the way it is. And I guess he doesn't want to have sex anymore. They never talked about it, but he ends up having an affair.
Oh,
And
wow.
so then she said, I guess sex was important to me. And
Wow.
instead of them pursuing it together, I don't really didn't talk to him. So I don't know what his perspective was. That maybe he felt like, well, my wife didn't want to have sex anymore. And so it's just something that was designed to be in the marriage relationship. It's not right to ever go outside of the marriage in that. And you want to, so that's where I come from. And if there's some issues that can't be overcome, okay, but it's worth exploring everything to have that. And I think, as we were talking yesterday in this interview, that I think what most people that I know that I talk to, they're kind of our stage of life, that have pursued the sexual relationship without, it becomes better in a lot of different ways over time. When you're young, I mean, like Nancy said in this interview, she said, it's just all hormones when you're first married and young, and it's just all that. But then there comes a spiritual depth to it. There's some things that happen over time. We were interviewing Jenny and Levi Lesko last week, and we talked about that a little bit. That's a podcast that'll be sometime.
Yep.
Coming up.
I think it's already out, actually.
Okay. That's all right.
We'll link to that in the show notes, of course.
You can cut that out. Okay, so I'll start that over. So we interviewed in the podcast that many of you may have listened to with Jenny and Levi Lesko. And then and Levi was saying the same thing up to their 19 years of marriage, and how that has continued to grow, and how important it is for them to do everything they can to continue to make that happen, because they see the benefit of it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think it's like, okay, so we'll go back to my silly analogy, because I tell you, I WD-40'd I feel like $1 million. I was like calling family members, like, listen to what I did. I took a step. But if I had just closed the door and said, I'm not going to that room anymore because that squeak irritates me, I'm closing the door to a whole section of the house. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and same in our relationship. If you just shut it down, you're not getting all that you can out of it. And
Absolutely.
so I'm curious with the couple, like, let's take, for example, the couple you said you had in counseling. They never talked about it. She thought it just didn't matter to him. Why would a couple never talk about this? Because I know most couples don't.
I think, and I do see couples, well, I think a lot of times when couples do talk about it, it's in a time of frustration. And so there may be anger. It's like you did or you didn't or you won't or whatever that goes into.
Yeah.
And so I think that shuts it down a lot of times, because then they're almost afraid to bring it up. Well, every time we talk about sex, we argue. Well, those are because we're talking about frequency or something like that, and we're arguing about that. And I think couples, two things that I've seen over the years, and I think a lot of couples are getting better at, that they don't talk about much, is their spiritual relationship and their sexual relationship. And I think those are two very important areas that we need to talk about. And how do we grow spiritually together? How do we grow sexually together? Because of the way God designed us. God designed us for that to be a part of our lives. And definitely procreation is part of that, obviously. But he wouldn't have made it as enjoyable, or made our bodies to be sensitive in certain areas, if we weren't supposed to enjoy it. And so, that's for Nancy and I. It was always, as long as we can, we want that to be a part of our lives.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it could have been just completely utilitarian. It's not.
Yeah,
it's not.
It's not.
It's enjoyable.
No.
Yeah.
It can be a little manual that says, do this, you'll have a child. When you're ready for another child, do this again. But no, that's not the way it was.
It's not like that. Yeah, it's not. People seem to figure it out without any manual and just make it happen. So why are we doing that in our marriage, right? I think it's a great point too, is like speaking out of frustration or out of the fear of frustration. I know a lot of us, a lot of couples, there are a lot of topics we avoid because one time we tried to talk about it and it didn't go well. So that just means, no, I'm not doing that again. But I love that you're really reminding us that it's a team approach. And you're so good at reminding us about that, because it's what can we do?
Yes.
What are we going to do to help this, instead of like, why aren't you Why do you? Those questions aren't helpful, but the team
Right.
approach is very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if say it is a doctor appointment and
Mm-hmm.
it can say, I will pray for you. I'll go to the appointment with you. I'll
Mm-hmm.
do whatever I can to support you in this. What do you need me to
Mm-hmm.
do? It is. It just, it's not like go get fixed and then come
Yeah.
back and we'll have sex.
Yeah.
It's like,
Right.
okay,
Right.
how do I come alongside you and walk through this with you?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's going to benefit both of us in the big picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's really good. We did that. I mean, it was just with a routine physical because we were. I am a little bit of a white coat phobic. I'm a little scared to go to the doctors, and I think Brian knew that. But we know, like, we're in our 40s now. We should go for a physical. And so when we talked about it, he said, "You know what I'll do? When I call to schedule mine, I'll just schedule you one too." And gosh, that just took such a weight off me because I just couldn't seem to like get it together to make that call myself. But he
Yeah,
called. We went, like, had appointments back to back, and we actually sat together in the room before the labs, before I had to go get the blood draw. And it was such a helpful thing for me because, when I just have it on my own and I'm thinking, I know I need to, I know I need to, I just don't
sure.
want to, I'm dreading it. But when it was like, hey, how can we both acknowledge we need to do this. And then it took a weight off my shoulders and we took care of it and everything was fine. So it was
But
such a
what a great
relief.
story. And I just I love Brian doing that. I mean,
Hmm.
he knew that was hard for you,
Yeah.
and he just came up with a solution that was really easy.
It was so
What it
easy.
took him probably 10 more seconds in the conversation making the
Exactly.
appointment, and
Exactly.
then
Yeah.
and then you got to go together with it and be there for each other. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a great example of what it means to come alongside each other,
Yeah.
to have empathy with your spouse, and to do what you can to help with that.
I think so too. And I think there's like such silly things that would prevent that from happening. There were times in our marriage where I thought, I think that's something a woman's supposed to do. I think a woman's supposed to call and make her appointments or make her, even her spouse's appointments. For some reason, I had this in my head. Maybe people do
Hmm.
that, but that's just not our story, my strengths,
Yeah,
whatever. I'm not the detail person. And um, so to just kind of get over those preconceived notions, why wouldn't he do that? Why would, that we don't have to put more
exactly,
pressure on
exactly.
ourselves?
Sure. It's just looking for at opportunities to things that we talk about to help your spouse, touch points. I mean, that
Yes.
meant a lot to you
Yeah, it
that
did.
he did that for you, and so
Hmm.
I think when we're aware and look at those things, and we're always looking for things to try to come alongside
Yes.
our spouse,
Yeah.
that they're there all the time.
I think so. And that's such a great point in this conversation because, with all of these things, even if one person is struggling, it is affecting both. And so that's fair to share that burden together.
Yes, absolutely.
So we've talked about like going to the doctor, counseling, all these things. What are there any other things you would add to address the issues?
Um, I think obviously, I guess we've probably talked about communication, obviously, and we've
Mm-hmm.
talked about that of how important it is. I mean, you got to talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think it goes back to why we didn't. You said that, and I talked about people just fight and those kind of
Yeah.
things. And it may just be saying, "Hey, we are struggling in this area. I'm struggling with this. I want this
Mm-hmm.
to be better. Let's talk about it. Will you help me work through this? And let's see what a next step would be for us." And
Mm-hmm.
that kind of a communication, and where you're
Mm-hmm.
just when you're inviting your spouse in to walk through that with you,
Mm-hmm.
instead of pointing the finger at each other, or accusing each other, or all those kind of things that we can get into, which does
Yeah.
nothing to help the sex life. And I think when we do that to our wives, I mean, our wives, their best sexual organ is their mind. And so when we put these other thoughts in there because are frustrated or something, well, that's not helping her at all in the
Yeah.
situation. You've got to talk about it as a team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so for sure. Yeah, and I think there's going to be a lot of mental clutter around that. There's going to be maybe feel some guilt, maybe feel like it's your fault. And I think with a lot of these things we're talking about, it is not. It is not.
No,
You're not at fault. You don't need to feel guilty for it or ashamed of it. And even going to a doctor or counselor, they deal with this every day. It is
right.
not going to shock them.
That's a good point. Yeah, you're not going to be the doctor's not going to go, "Oh my gosh, I've never heard that before."
Yeah,
No,
yeah, yeah.
no, the doctor, he or she is going to help you.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And so just go ahead and let go of that because there's help available and you need to go ahead and be willing to ask for it so that you can receive it.
Absolutely.
So once we've talked about all that, what about some physical disabilities or changes that will not be resolved?
Yeah, and I know that happens.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there's a lot of ways to have intimacy. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just cuddling and hugging and kissing.
Mm-hmm.
Couples that because of some physical limitations of one or the other, that they may manually please each other, or they can, there's just something about how do we get close and how do we get intimate.
Mm-hmm.
If we can't have intercourse, what can we do that's going to draw us closer together in a sexual way?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's another thing to talk about. Well, yeah, I, this this is painful. I don't think this would be. Let's try this way of becoming close. And again,
Mm-hmm.
it's figuring out for you something
Mm-hmm.
that works for the two of you. But I think the way God created us, we have these touch receptors all over our body,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly we have those in the genital area. But there's a lot to be said for just that cuddling and hugging and letting those touch receptors get you ignited just because you're
Mm-hmm.
close to each other, just because your two bodies are close to each other, whether there's intercourse or not. So I think it's again figuring out what you can do, what you can't do, and then making the best of what you have in whatever the situation is.
Yeah, sure. So I love that you're saying there's other ways. So it sounds like you're saying sex does not have to mean just intercourse.
Right. Right. I think it's yes. And I think there's, one of the books I really like because it's illustrated is Celebration of Sex by Dr. Douglas Rosenau,
Mm-hmm.
Rosenau.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in there are some ways to be sexual with each other without having intercourse. So I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And he's a Christian, and it's very
Mm-hmm.
tasteful. It's not like some weird thing or far
Yeah.
out thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, finding a resource like that can give you some ideas that maybe you haven't thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's working together. If
Mm-hmm.
one of you is saying, "Gal, we ought to order that," we ought to order that. Well, the other
Mm-hmm.
one needs to order it. Or
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great resource for sure. And I think it's a great one for anyone who's knows that there's some information out there that they don't have yet. It's just really
Yeah,
explanatory.
which is a good point. I think sometimes as guys, we feel like we're supposed to know it all because we're a guy, and we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the more we can learn, because you know, nobody. As a guy, you've got to become an expert on your wife and what
Mm-hmm.
she likes and what she doesn't like, and on her body. Um, and you don't learn that just because you're a guy. You learn
Mm-hmm.
it by communicating with your spouse and learning and growing and seeing that that's okay to grow.
Yeah.
Read the Song of Solomon. That's as intimate as you can get.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you just said you don't know that just because you're a guy. Like you're not actually bored or like with all that
No,
built in.
and we want to act like and maybe we outgrow that. I think I did, but at high school, it's like, yeah, I don't ever think about that.
Oh gosh.
When you know nothing at all. But so I think
Oh,
that carries over, and there's so much to learn about from a guy's standpoint about a woman and her body,
yes.
and especially your wife,
Yes.
that you don't know unless you're communicating with the person you're married to.
Yeah. And I think that's it reminds me of what the Luscos were telling you about how, sex life gets better. And I think that's a big part of it. You get to know each other better. That's a huge part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Huge.
I mean, really, when we look back at Nancy and I first year of marriage at 20 years old, it was definitely hormone driven, and we didn't know much about each other. I mean, sex was great then, but it has changed and matured.
Yeah.
Physical is still great, but there's so much more depth to it at this stage of life
Yes.
than there was back then. And we've seen that grow throughout our marriage. There are bumps
Yeah.
along the way for sure.
Yes,
But
for sure.
but over the period of time, yeah, you have some times that, nothing was working because we weren't working, basically.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're at 19 years too. And it's like this, it's just funny to think about how much we thought it would just kind of happen. Like we thought it would be just some romantic scene that fell into place, because that's what really our culture does predispose us to think, that it would just
Oh, yeah.
work out without ever having to be discussed. And so I love that we're just being really open about the fact that you do have to talk about it. And that's a normal thing to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is fun. It's funny. And I think and I think it's a good point because I think sometimes we kind of do think it's just, well, it's something we just do. I mean, the animals do pretty good on it. Well, the
Right.
animals don't have souls like we do. They don't have,
Right.
God didn't create them in the same way. And a lot of theirs is just for procreation, I guess.
Hmm.
So I think it is taking the time to look at the two of you and talk
Yeah.
about it.
Well, and I think too, it warrants saying that, like, I know for probably most couples, I know for us premaritally, you would think that it would fall into place because you do have those hormones raging and you're trying to stay pure. And so you're like, man, it seems like it would just be really simple to just have great sex all the time if, in marriage. But the reality is the hormones do kind of taper off, die down. Other things, you start to see other things more like stressors, and so that kind of balances
Yes.
out. And so it's easy to see why we would think that it would fall into place when we're on the early side of it. And then once things kind of shake out, that changes for everyone I've ever talked to. I won't say every couple, but every couple I've ever met.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think that's interesting how you said that because I do think the hormones are there, and so all that is there, and then as that begins to or whatever, I think it's like for a husband and a wife. The husband sees his wife early on probably have having the same kind of sex drive he does,
Hmm.
because at that point, if you have waited, it's on like, wow, we're going to
Hmm.
enjoy this as much as we can. And then I think the reality for a woman sets in of that her mind really is her greatest sex organ, and all of a sudden
Hmm.
he was not very kind to me, and
Hmm.
now he wants to have sex, and so then you have to begin to deal with, okay, how do we make this work, and what really
Hmm.
does keep us both desiring each other, and that's and keep that as an important part of our life.
Yeah. And I think that's important to talk about because I think it can be really frustrating to think, okay, things were good. Why is it not like that now? And I think that there's a lot of factors that go into that, but I think it's important, to get that on the table.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Did you have something else you're going to say about that?
Well, I think I think we talk about a lot of what a woman has to, and I think there's
Mm,
guys that struggle with things too. I think it seems like from counseling perspective, the vast majority is with the wife in those situations because of
hmm.
just how a woman is wired. But I know guys can have some issues too.
Hmm.
So I'm not leaving those out or saying those aren't important either.
Hmm. Yeah, totally. And so some of this, I'm wondering, like, how much does our mindset about our physical factors play in? Like, I'm thinking about after having babies, when I was feeling really self-conscious about how my body changed. Our bodies do change for various reasons. It could be any number of things. How much do you think our mindset about that is going to impact our sex life?
I think women are more concerned about than others, and that's just being observant, Nancy. I mean, just when we take photos, and I
Hmm.
think, God, that's a great picture of us, and she sees one little hair out of place on her or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. So I think women are much more self conscious than their husbands are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for us as our husbands, we need to continue to affirm our wives and tell her how attracted we are to her and how beautiful she is.
Mm-hmm.
Because over time, we all change,
Mm-hmm.
but I see beauty in Nancy. I think she's beautiful outside, but I've seen an inside beauty that I didn't really see much of when we first got
Mm-hmm.
married because it hadn't lived that long together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we need to continue to affirm our wives because I think women in our culture are. It's tough being a woman. All
Mm-hmm.
this stuff is thrown at you all the time of how you should look or how you shouldn't look and what
Mm-hmm.
you should wear and what your body should look like. And really, what you want it to be is to know that your husband loves you, is attracted to you, uh, cherishes you. I had a guy say this in counseling not that long ago, and she was talking about the way her body had changed since I think they've had 3 children. And he said, anything I look at that, I think about how much I love you and that you were
Mm.
willing to carry our children and bring those children into us. He said, that's a beautiful thing to me. And it was
Hmm.
just, you could just see her whole countenance change as he
Hmm.
said that. It's like,
Mhm.
I don't have to worry about that anymore because
Yeah.
he sees it differently. And so I think that's where the communication comes in.
Mhm.
And it's okay to tell your husband, I don't feel as good about my body as I used to.
Mhm.
And as a husband, then to affirm her, um, because the guys, we don't look that great all the time either. So it's not like we're Atlas at 20 and we stay Atlas for the rest of our lives or something like that. We have changed too. I just think we don't think about that as much as our wives do. I mean, I want to be fit for Nancy. I want to be healthy for Nancy. I want to be healthy in a way that our sex life can continue our whole marriage. But other than that, it's not like I'm self-conscious about if I get a wrinkle or if I get a stretch mark or if I get something like that. It's like, okay, so
yeah,
for a woman, becomes very self-conscious of those things, right?
It can be. It can. I think there are a lot of different levels of that for sure. And that's something I think. I think for me, I've battled to a place where understanding the context of how important our body is has changed a lot because of my theology. Because I've come to understand that like our body is what God gives us in order to live, right? So like if we don't have it,
yeah,
we're not alive. And so for me, understanding that, and we did that whole series on stewardship of our physical, mental, emotional, spiritual health over the summer. But I think for me, that's helped put things in perspective, is to look at it and say, you know what? I didn't pick this. This is what God gave me. It's a gift. And where would I be without it? That to me has helped shape things. And so that's important. But I know that is for different people. There's all different levels of how important that is. But I think the reason I mention my perspective is because my perspective has changed. I used to be a lot more self-conscious. And so I would like for anyone who's listening who is there to know that you don't have to stay there. Because I think there's a lot of freedom you can find from that.
Absolutely. And God created us, each one perfect. God didn't create you and say, darn, I made a mistake. No. And he loves you. And the person you're married to loves you. And, so I think it's easy to be hard on yourself, and you don't need to be. And I think just accepting who you are and rejoicing in that, there's a lot to be said for that.
I think so. And I think the more you can start to say, hey, God made me. God made me. He made me on purpose. And so who am I to tell him he did it wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's an important part of the mindset for sure. So moving forward, I think one thing I'd like to kind of wrap up with is, what are some ways to stay close and to look forward, not backward, in the sexual relationship?
I think I think for us maybe, and I think we got into this of realizing at some point, maybe it was, 10 or 15 years into marriage, that our sex life is better than it was back then. And I think we both kind of clicked at about the same time that this is something that can continue to grow. And I think just having that mindset is helpful. And then I think some of the things that we do to bond ourselves with each other, especially things we do before marriage that don't include intercourse, things like hugging and kissing and cuddling and putting your arm around each other, or those kind of things that bond us together, are things that we need to continue to do on a daily basis. Because I think when we don't do that, it's like, we haven't even touched for 20 days and now you want to have sex, instead of just continue to cultivate that the way God made us, and so we can look forward in the sexual relationship. And I think knowing that if there are bumps in the road as we go ahead, that for most of them, there's going to be an answer for. And I know there's exceptions, but most of them are being there. And together, you're going to do whatever you can to help your sex life continue to be part of your married life throughout your whole marriage. And so I think if we come to that, and I think for those who do, and a lot of people bring baggage into marriage, and sometimes that baggage continues to be a problem. Maybe for that, it's time to get counseling and work through those things and let that go. Because I think in marriage, what God designed in sex in marriage is very different than the world tells us, or sex outside of marriage. And so sometimes it's making that transition to this and not bringing guilt or shame or any of those into it, to see this really as an incredible gift that God gave us. And to know that if we've had struggles in our sexual relationship, that doesn't mean we have to struggle the rest of our life. It's to
Mm-hmm.
say, let's learn from this. Okay, what do we learn? Do we need to get some help? Do we need to go to counseling? Do we need to
Mm-hmm.
go to a doctor? And let's move forward with this and let's work on improving it instead of just giving up.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good. Yeah, that's good. That's a great place for us to land on this. So I love that you mentioned the book Celebration of Sex. We'll have the link to that in the show notes. But are there any other books or other resources you'd recommend on this?
I did a little research and I haven't read these, but I found a few that I thought were really good, especially with the disability thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a book called The Ultimate Guide to Sex and Disability for all of
Hmm.
us who live with disabilities, chronic pain, and illness.
Hmm.
And I think that was a good book that I saw. And then there was a real simple one. It's even in a comic book style,
Hmm.
but it's written by an author who does have disabilities. It's called Quick and Easy Guide to Sex and Disability.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found a website, Better Health Channel, it's what it's called,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a lot of stuff on disability and sexuality. So there's some good resources out there. Now,
Yeah.
I think with anything we say here, I want to put the disclaimer is that we're not, they may or may not be Christian based. But I think when you're talking about the body and disabilities, there's some
Mm-hmm.
really good information out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think it's really great to point to those too, because like you said, people are not asking a ton about that in person.
Right.
So these are probably some great places to turn to if you need help
Absolutely.
with that. Yeah, that's really great. Well, do you have any final piece of advice for us before we leave this topic today?
Well, I think that we all have some kind of obstacles often on our sex life. I don't think
Hmm.
there's any couple that hadn't had to work through with things. Physical barriers is just another thing
Hmm.
that I think we want to try to work through. And so, what I would just say is that um, if you work through those and your sex life is good now, just continue to work on it and enjoy it. And if you've hit a wall or you've hit a bump in the road, um, use this as kind of a catalyst to get you guys in some
Hmm.
conversations about what can we do, how do we get back to what we had, or how do we get to something better than we've ever had in our marriage.
Oh, that's so good. Yes, that's great. This is your sign. If you've been waiting for a little nudge, this is the time.
Yes.
Well, thank you for sharing all of your wisdom and insight with us. And I hope and pray this conversation has been encouraging and helpful. Um, thanks for sharing your time with us today. If you need anything from us, you can always contact us at info@awesomemarriage.com. We answer each and every email, and we love to chat with you, connect with you, pray with you. Make sure you're following us over on Facebook and on Instagram, where you can get in touch with us. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.